Hi there, and welcome to B Shifter. I'm your host, John Vance. Thanks for joining us. On this episode, we'll be talking with Don Abbott, who heads up Project Mayday.net. Don has been a fire chief and ran one of the first command simulations back in the 90s with his wife, Bev, as they toured the country with his Abbottville command simulation classes. Don later went on to work for Chief Alan Bernasini at the Phoenix Command Training Center, helping with computer simulations. Since his retirement from Phoenix, Don has been collecting data on Maydays and trying to get to the root cause in order to help prevent them from happening. He and his group have studied over 10,000 Maydays, and they are publishing information on ProjectMayday.net that has shed light on emerging issues such as sleep deprivation in the fire service, emotional issues, and their proximal causes related to Maydays, and air management, just to name a few. We'll get into it in detail with Don here. We're also joined on this episode by Blue Card Program Manager and co-host, Josh Bloom. So sit back and enjoy B Shifter with Don Abbott. Thanks for being here today. It's really good to see you, and thanks for all the work. We haven't got to see you, through the pandemic and everything else, so it's really nice to connect with you again, and you continue to feed us a lot of great information in the American Fire Service. And I think you and I also, I was thinking about this last night, we have the distinction as we both work for fire departments that no longer exist, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I was at Harris, you were at the Warren Township,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And
that no longer exists.
No longer, but we're still working, so that's good. Well, thanks for joining us today. And first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Mayday project. And I think it's important that people understand the work that goes behind that data collection. So where does it start? And then kind of explain the different components of that for us too.
The person that started this all out was Bruno. Multiple discussions at classes on why we were traveling and those kinds of things, and realizing that there was no data. Everybody talked about near misses and everybody talked about Maydays, but nobody really had numbers. And we were talking about something we really didn't have the facts on. So basically, we started out looking at Maydays in general. And as the numbers started to roll in, we could see that there was more Maydays than I think what we realized. We think we now get about 22 to 25% of the Maydays that occur. We get about 7 a day, and on the average. And we're right now, we've been doing this for 6 years. We're now over the 10,000 mark. And so we've developed and saw patterns and trends, things that we know are problems and that have continually either gotten worse because we haven't addressed them, or have gotten better because we did address them and we did some training. So we're hoping that this really pays off in the end, that the data and the information we provide is a foundation for an organization to take the information and the data and update their own training and to protect their people and prevent Maydays, because that's what this is really about. We're here to prevent them more than we are probably anything else.
With the data that you get, it's self-reporting.
Yes.
A department brings that to you.
For the most part. We have now 5 states where the fire marshal has dictated to the fire service in those states that if they have a Mayday, they have to submit that Mayday to their office within 48 hours. And then when they get it, they send it to us. And we do some of the legwork for them, which is okay because we get the data. But for the most part, it's self-reporting.
And a part of that data is you're actually listening to the radio traffic and you get some other information.
Yes, when we first get notification, we try to establish a contact person within the fire department. And we ask, there's a list of things we ask for. There's 3 things initially: the audio tape of the incident, a transcript of the incident if there may be one. And the third thing is we'd like to have a copy of the tactical worksheet that the incident commander used, which in and of itself has been everything from a legal pad to a form, and Bruno would be proud, even a napkin, you know. So that's what we asked for initially. And then when we get that information, we ask for 5 more additional things: copies of SOPs on Mayday procedures, RIT team operations, those kinds of things, training on Maydays and RIT, what those curriculums look like. Then we ask for individual interview time with the victim, with the incident commander, and with the company officer of that victim. So, and then when we get that back, we send out another notice and we ask for 5 more things. And career departments have been good about that because there's a lot of information that we're asking for that takes a little bit of time and energy to do. We're up to almost 4,000 Maydays from the volunteer service, which we don't include into the career. They're a standalone, just like the career are. And it's difficult for them. So my wife sort of pairs up with whoever their representative is, and she sort of walks them through it. She does a lot of the work with the volunteer fire departments. She does a lot of work to begin with, but she does more so with the volunteer departments. So,
did you notice some? Because I was looking at the 2020 career versus volunteer, and I noticed some disparities. I
yes.
mean, what do you see in this time around between the volunteer and the career?
The disparities are pretty much the same. I mean, to a certain extent. I think the one thing that we're truly probably most proud of is the fact that what was number 1 3 years ago, falls through the roof, is now number 3. And for the volunteers, it's like 4 or 5 because they don't get on roofs. For the most part, they don't do roof ventilation like most career departments do, regardless of manning or staffing issues or equipment issues or whatever it might, training or whatever it might be. So when I talk to volunteer groups, we're talking about some different problems. Now, they have the same number 1 issue that we have in the career service. And basically that is getting lost or separated off hose lines. That is number 1. It represents almost 20% of our Maydays. For the volunteers, it's 27% of the Maydays that we're starting to see now. So,
Don, before we go too much further, I think it's important that we tell everybody, because we're saying self-reporting, and indeed it is. It's whatever information that they're willing to give you and collect. But
right.
You're verifying information too. So I think it's important that we talk about that, because there's data flying all over the fire service that is indeed self-reporting, and it's just whatever I decided to tell you, and then nobody verifies it. So can you just talk briefly about how do you verify some of this information?
We're pretty straightforward. In a letter that I send early to the chief, it basically in that letter states that we, in order to include your Mayday into our system, there are certain requirements that have to be met. And if you don't meet them, we will not include them in our data, because that's our, what I refer to as that as our verification that what you're presenting is correct. And it's not what you're presenting, it's the facts of what actually happened. Because I think in general, we all sort of don't want to be the bad guy, or we don't want to air our dirty laundry. But in order to get the data that we've got, that's what we've got to do. And sometimes they're a little leery of that. And I always tell them, I never mention fire department names or never put any fire department names out there unless I have their permission. And if I have their permission and it's in writing, then we'll share whatever that department submitted. But otherwise, I don't mention names because I want to keep this confidential. But at the same time, those who we're seeing, where before at the beginning of this, the first 2 or 3 years, about 8% of the departments, would freely associate their name along with the Mayday. That number is closer now to almost 20%. But so it's going up. And I think it's mainly because we're trying to explain to them that your Mayday is not so much different than somebody else's Mayday somewhere else in the country, or a Mayday that's going to happen down the road. So share what your Mayday was, what you learned from your Mayday, and how they might prevent it in the near future.
So I think one other thing, just so people understand it, and in your website you clearly, I think, explain it. But it's not just you. There's a group of people, right?
Yes.
That are working on this. So it's a huge undertaking, and I mean, I say thank you over and over again for all the work you're doing with it and everything you're putting out about it. And it's important. I think people realize that this is truly validated information and data, not a one person sent me this and this is what I'm going to put out there. So the group of people working on it, I think that if we can just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I have what I call 8 professionals. These are doctors. Last year or year before last, we brought on an epidemiologist who retired out of the CDC, moved here to be closer to his daughter, and sort of got him roped into volunteering some of his time and energy. And he did well up until the pandemic, and then he got a real job locally. And but now he's back with us because that job pretty much finished. We brought on an audiologist, Dr. McNeil, who has been a saint in this because we've saw a large number of Maydays taking place where hearing aids have either melded onto the ear or into the ear. And so it's become an issue that we've been putting out there that if your department doesn't have a policy about people wearing hearing aids, you need to develop one. Not to say that it shouldn't be a thing that you use to exclude somebody, but you need to be aware that I've got some pictures that we use on our website that aren't very pretty to look at, but they're firefighters who either had a hearing aid melt on top of their ear or actually melted into their ear. Most of those who had the hearing melt into their ear. And then we have 24 advisory board members. All of them have had, 5 of them are firefighters who've had Maydays. 5 are company officers whose crews had Maydays. 4 battalion chiefs, 3 safety officers, 3 training officers, and 3 chiefs that sort of make up our advisory board. And we try to meet the week before FDIC every year. Last year we did a Zoom thing, which went okay, but it's still not as good as getting face to face. And our plan is we're meeting the last week in July, just before FDIC in Indianapolis. And we'll talk about everything we've learned from the previous year and what we want to do next year and the next 2 years, sort of putting together a game plan. And so those people, the advisory board people, all 8 of them who are doctors, with the exception of 2, those people are professionals and they're doctors and they volunteer their time just like the advisory board. We brought on 2 new people this year, or actually end of last year. One used to work for an SCBA manufacturer, so he knows pretty much the ins and outs of the SCBAs. And one of them used to work for the major radio communications people that we brought on board, who has been working with us in regards to frequency fade and some of the issues that are out there about problems with communications.
Great. Thank you for that. I think it's important that we just make sure that people understand where the information comes from that you're putting out there, because like I said, I can do a study and put it out on the internet, and if somebody reads it, well, here it is. Here's the latest. And it's like, well, how's it verified? And how'd you come up with all the information, and who's really involved with it? So
yeah, it takes us about, on the average, somewhere between 50 and 75 days for that Mayday to actually get into our data, because we want to confirm, especially when you start getting into what I call the root causes, that's when you've got to talk to the victim, you got to talk to the company officer, and you need to talk to the incident commander. why did this happen? When did it happen? And could we have prevented it? And so if you don't have those conversations, you're just taking somebody at their word that, this was a freak thing. Well, maybe it wasn't, especially when you look at departments, that have more Maydays than others. I guess that's probably the best way to be polite, the politically correct way to say it, that have more Maydays than others. Well, why is that? And there's a lot of reasons we're seeing for that. Training, freelancing. One of the problems that we see, and it's a consistently significant problem, is we don't enforce our SOPs. We'll enforce the SOP that you look sloppy and you're out of uniform and we'll send you home. But the guy who violates the SOP out on the fire ground that ends up getting himself hurt or somebody else, it's an accident. Those things happen. No, there's a violation there, just like the uniform violation, but we ignore it.
Were you at the table next to us at breakfast today? Because that's exactly what we were talking about.
Okay. No, but I've had these conversations with a lot of people, and it's I read their SOP, and okay, their SOP says they shouldn't be doing this, so I'll email whoever my point person is and say, I've read your SOP and it says this, and you did this. It doesn't match up. Well, we don't always follow our SOPs. We have training rules and SOPs. No, they got to be the same, or close. Mm-hmm. They can't be 180s. So it's an issue. I believe that the most important person on a fire department is a company officer, because they're supervising 24 hours a day on the shift. Where a battalion chief maybe sees them twice a day, maybe if you're lucky. Chief probably doesn't see him, but maybe once every 2 weeks or so. So that company officer is a critical component, yet company officers are not doing their jobs. And I know if you're a company officer out there, I probably turned you off, but the reality is it's not all of you. It's just the ones who decide and pick and choose what SOPs they want to follow and what ones they want to ignore. And it can't be that way. You can't pick and choose those things.
And departments need to have a solid process in place to address that. So
yes.
if you have an SOP that is on the books that you're not following, it needs to come off the books, and you need to review the SOPs on a regular basis to make sure that they are still germane to your organization and still being followed. And, we've come up, like white powder SOPs.
Yes.
Okay. That happened after 9/11, 19, 20 years ago. That's come off the books because we're just not maintaining that, correct?
We had a Mayday we got in March, and I'm reading the SOPs, and the date on the SOP for the Maydays is 11 years old. Never been reviewed, never been rewritten. And I'm thinking a lot has changed in 11 years. I don't care what fire department it is, things change, and I guess we ignore the easy things. That's an easy fix. And we sort of, I don't want to say we bury our heads in the sand, but the reality is we just don't pay a great deal of attention to some of the details that we should.
Yes.
And I think, and as I said earlier, you guys said you talked about this at breakfast, I think when I read these SOPs and then when you listen to these audio tapes, they don't match up. You're thinking to yourself, okay, what's the problem here? And part of it is they're not enforcing your SOPs on the fire ground.
So, we talk a lot about the whole SOP thing, and, far too often the SOP comes from the administration and there's really no training on it, right? So we really don't set that expectation of what the SOP is. So, it's really that SOP has to connect to everybody and everybody has to be on the same page. And so often it's just like, we push an SOP out. It looks good. We had to have it. Somebody said we needed to have it, but we really didn't go over it and talk about it. And I see that over and over and over again when we go to organizations that we're doing training with that have a Mayday SOP, and it's like, have you ever exercised this ever? And the answer is no. Like 95+% of the time, the Mayday SOP, they read it. It's never been exercised in a training environment. They don't talk about it, and they put it out. Somebody signs it. Yep, I saw it. And it's like, do you really think that's going to work when somebody says Mayday, Mayday, Mayday? If they're not familiar with it, it might be the best practice out there, but it's just not going to happen if we don't train on it.
Exactly. And sometimes, we put those SOPs out there just because we're supposed to, or people expect us to, and nobody trains on it. I'm a firm believer that you got to train on an SOP before you put it out. So, one of the best chiefs I ever had, when an SOP came out, the SOPs were always on a yellow page, but there was a pink page attached to it. And it was his interpretation of the SOP. So you knew where the chief stood, and everybody always read the pink page first, because on there it said, if you violate this SOP, it could be 1 day off, or it could be 3 days off, or it could be termination, So everybody read the pink page before they read the yellow page, because they knew what was going to happen if you didn't follow the yellow page. And I don't think that's happening these days. I think we say these, we give it a lot of lip service, but we just don't follow up with. I can remember here in Phoenix at the CTC, when we were looking at a variety of principles that we were going to put into practice. On deck was one of them, and Mayday was another. And we would actually write to Mayday, or write to the SOP through simulations at the CTC, exercise all 3 shifts, and then come back and rewrite it based on what we learned. And I think we went through 5, 6, variations of the Mayday SOP before we got it right. And it's one of the things that Bruno said, when we put this out, it's going to be right. I'm not going to change it 6 weeks from now because it didn't work. Let's make sure it's right. And so, John Hinton, Terry Garrison, and Nick, they're the ones that spearheaded and put the thing in, and came and practiced it every shift. I mean, they came to the CTC. We brought the battalion chiefs in. We ran through the same one, saw some of the same issues on every shift, rewrote it, and then, tried another one. We got to tweak this in a little bit because it didn't work in that particular, for whatever reason. So I think a lot of it is the fact that we rely on these SOPs thinking that they're the 10 Commandments. And the reality is, when Moses come down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, it didn't work because nobody was going to practice it. It's the same way here. We've got to practice it and make sure it works before we implement it.
Before we get back into your project, I just wanted to talk about command training a little bit and your involvement in it. You've probably been doing command training since before I was in the fire service. So how did you start with command training? And then what are you finding out there right now with the information that you're getting? How many people are actually doing command training? We
started, when I go back, and we recently went back and looked at our own personal archives. We started doing command training in basically 1991. And then in 1993, I built Abbottville, which was a diorama that was 12 by 12 feet and had 300 plus buildings on it. And we burned them and smoked them and everything else. And that's how I taught command training, is that using radios, having them place the little fire truck and lay the hose, or if they didn't lay the right size hose. And then what did they do with their little men, all that kind of stuff. And today, simulations has sort of taken that same approach, but made it better, because you can redo these things much quicker than what I could on my tabletop. But I think the thing that we're seeing that to me is a little bit alarming, and I want to go through it sort of from two sides. One of the things is we need to train company officers in Mayday operations, because 30+% of most Maydays take place before a battalion chief gets there. And if a company officer doesn't know how to run a Mayday, they're in trouble, So I think we've got to extend some of that officer development training. The second thing that we're seeing in our data is we see a lot of Maydays that do not go well. And I will say they're close to 65 to 70% that do not go well because the person is the IC is a ride-out captain, somebody that, for whatever reason, the normal BC's on vacation, so I'm going to move a captain up and have him take his place. Well, has that captain been trained to the same level?
What has changed since you started collecting this data? What are the trends that you're seeing right now?
Well, the one thing that we're seeing that, and it may not be a trend. It may have been there to begin with. We didn't ask some of these questions early, and we didn't get some of the responses that we probably needed to get. But we're seeing a large number of concussions. And, if you stop and think about how concussions are now being handled in sports, how are we as the fire service handling concussions? Probably pretty piss poor, in regards to, a guy comes out of the building and says, man, that ceiling come down, drove me to my knees. Oh, okay. Maybe he needs to be checked out, or make sure that the company officer knows you need to watch this guy, and so forth. And concussions is one of those things. The hearing aid issue is another one of those things. Communications. I think the one thing, if I had the money and if there's one thing I could fix around the country, it would be to make sure that every fire department could talk to their neighboring fire department. They would have that capability. We don't see that. There are fire departments where battalion chiefs are carrying 3 radios so they can talk to their mutual aid. With no help. I'm sitting in this thing and what department was, okay, which radio was that? And that's killing us right now. I mean, it's getting people in significant trouble because we are slow to respond for a variety of reasons. Gosh, that engine, they're not from my department, but they're having a Mayday. I need to make sure their chief knows that, well, no, you need to take care of the Mayday because it's your scene. They're your problem, regardless of what department they're from. So those 3 things, and I guess probably as much as anything, we're seeing sleep deprivation as being a big upcoming issue. And what sleep deprivation does to people that work 48s and 72s, especially if there's any depression or anxiety involved, if they're had a fight with their wife before they came to work that morning, or their kids didn't want to go to school, anything that sets them out of their norm when they start to work. And we're starting to see some that we weren't asking these questions 5 years ago, 3 years ago. Yeah, 5 to 3 years ago. We weren't asking those questions. Now we are. And what we're seeing is a wake-up call, I think, to the fire service that we've got to take that issue more serious than what we've done in the past.
That's all really good information. So are we, Bruno always used to say, we're not finding any new ways to really get ourselves into trouble. So is there anything that stands out like a new way, or should we really have learned over the last 50 years from a whole lot of events?
I think we should have learned from a whole lot of events, but there are patterns to what we see. If you go in with a crew of 4 people, probably the person in most cases, and I think it's in the high 50% range, the person that's most likely to have the Mayday is the engineer, because that engineer probably only goes in on 1 out of every 12 fires. Probably hasn't worn an air pack in recent months. And when you go to training, where does that engineer, what does he do? He pumps the engine. He ain't going in as part of your crew. And we're seeing a lot of situations where the engineers are being because they're older, they got more experience to a certain extent, put in situations they probably shouldn't be put into simply because, well, they're the engineer. We've worked together for 10 years, and you've been on the job 20 years. So I'll give you the leeway I wouldn't give somebody that's got 3 or 4 years on. The problem is that we don't make them part of the crew except when we need to. And we need to do that in training. So I think if we did it in training, those numbers would drop. But I think because we sort of, the engineer's out at the truck, that's where they stay until we need them. Now, all of a sudden, we don't need them at the truck because we're going to be a crew of 4 going in. They are the weak link in most systems that we're seeing.
So you brought up a bit, so you're saying 4-person staffing, right? And we know in our country that's
not happening. No.
It's very few and far between, but since you brought it up, I'll ask the question is,
sure.
Are you seeing more Maydays in fire departments and staffing where they got 4 persons on a fire truck or?
3s and 4s. Yeah, 3s and 4s. And the reason why is the main reason why, especially in 2 of the categories, mainly lost and separated from hose, is because I think we have this mindset that as either the company officer or as a firefighter going in, that we can do more because we have more. I think when you go in with a crew of 2, you sort of don't go in quite as quick. You don't go in quite as far. You don't get off the hose line quite as far because it's just 2 of you. Where there's a crew of 4, you have a tendency maybe to do things that you normally wouldn't, that you would do simply because you think you can get away with it. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit. But the largest number of Maydays is with crews of 3, then 4s, and then 2s. And when we did all of our interviews with the victims and so forth, and then the company officers, when we talked to the company officers who had a 2-person crew, their thing was, there's just 2 of us. I'm not going to let him get very far away. And to sort of add on to that, one of the things that was brought to our attention starting about 4 years ago, we started asking the question more and more, and now it's part of our routine, part of our survey. But most firefighters do not know how much hose they have taken in until they run out. That's when they figured out, instead of a crew of 4 having somebody, and we're talking about residents, big box, that, it's a little bit different story. But in a residence, it's you need that person feeding hose at the door. And every time a coupling goes by, you guys got 100 feet, you guys got 150 feet, you have 200 feet, that's it, We need to be sort of announcing those things over the radio to the crew inside so they've got an idea just how much hose they've got in there. And you're thinking, it's only a 1,500 square foot house and we've got 200 feet of hose in here. Where's the loops at? Where are we going to get in trouble? And we don't do that. So that's something that we've sort of been promoting is if you have a crew of 4 and maybe even a crew of 3, you don't necessarily have to leave the person at the door with the crew of 3, but somebody needs to be checking on the hose. A fairly large career department. Just recently, they spent a ton of money to do it, but they've basically colored the first 100-foot section is red because it's the hot. The next section is orange. Next 50-foot section, they're all in 50. So if in your hands you've got green hose, it's 150 feet. That's an expensive way of doing it, but I'm interested to see what their statistics are here in a couple of years, because they had 3 back-to-back Maydays involving people getting off hose lines. And, somebody come up and said, hey, I think, I got an idea. So they went and equipped 1 battalion, 4 engines, and they actually have some attack line on an aero ladder because it has a pump. With this layup, everybody come back and said, hey, man, this is great. Let's do it department-wide. So they're doing it department-wide now. But I think sometimes we just don't know how, we just had a Mayday here in the Valley recently, and they're 300 feet into the building. Wow. And it is a commercial building, but why? And they're on a second level. They actually went up as well, and you're thinking, this is a lot of hose. Do we need to really be in here this deep? And they had zero visibility. When they got to the second floor, that's what they reported to command. We have zero visibility. We need somebody to help us with our hose, move the hose. Those two don't connect, being in zero visibility and we need help moving hose. Those two things don't sort of connect up. And then 46 seconds later, it's getting hotter than hell in here. Now add that into the equation, we need to be backing out. Didn't do it, went in about 30 more feet, got caught in a flashover. Sometimes, again, like I've said before, we're our own worst enemies because we've gotten away with it in the past, we'll get away with it now. Things change, more and more plastics, more and more things that when they burn, they burn at a very high rate of heat output and put out some of the blackest smoke you would ever see. You'd think you have a tire fire. But if you looked at what's burning, it is probably 3 or 4 old tires that have been recycled, into a rug, that kind of stuff. So
you said something there, and I don't want to get too far away from it without going there. It seems like in our industry, we're really good at throwing tools at trying to solve the problem. So I'll just give you said, fire department has some people and they get off the hand line, lost, disoriented, whatever, maybe went too far. So they're going to change some hose so that can remind people where they are, right? Got 3 firemen, got burnt. Oh, we're going to increase the TPP rating on our turnout gear. I had firemen run out of air. So we're going to increase how much air that we carry. So, do you see that? You've been around a long time, but that's not solving the problem, right?
No, it's not.
We're really good at solving.
I always tell people those are Band-Aids and excuses that you're not fixing the problem, and you're not addressing the problem as a fix. You're just putting a Band-Aid on something that is going to happen again. It's just like, let's give everybody a radio, and so everybody will be able to communicate. Yeah, that doesn't work either. Then you don't get any airtime to report your Mayday because everybody's on the radio, type stuff. Even though those radios are important to be in people's hands, it doesn't mean they have that just because I give 38 people a radio at the scene of a fire doesn't mean they all have to talk. Most of them should be listening, not talking.
Again, that's a training issue, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. We buy radios, gave them to them, didn't tell them what to do with them.
Yes. Yeah. Or the orange buttons. I think the one thing I've learned, there are more policies on the use of the EA button in this country than there is anything else. There are some policies that you're wondering, what the hell are we doing? Let's take those buttons off the radio. We're doing a disservice to ourselves. For most cities, when we buy radios, it's for the cops. And we have to fit into what the cops want. And as a result, the EA buttons, for a cop, you push the EA button for most cops, especially with the new radios. When you push that EA button, it lets dispatch know that I'm in a situation where don't talk to me. I will talk to you because they don't want that, over the air. But we're putting that EA button out there. And a lot of people don't realize that when you push that button, because the radios were purchased under a bulk, that when you push that button, nobody's going to talk to you because that's the police policy. We have a Mayday that's exactly what happened. The fireman pushed the EA button and it was dead silence. He could talk to command, but, dispatcher, nobody else was answering him because of the way their system was developed. So they went back and spent $2.4 million to fix the problem. And that was that we shouldn't have cop radios. We need fire radios. And Motorola is getting better at that. Prices so's the price of those radios. So
yes, they have gone up.
Oh yes, they have gone up.
And my department, until this last cycle, we were using hand-me-down cop radios. So they weren't even new cop radios. They were The police department's done with it now. Now the fire department can have it because they're just going to wreck them, right?
Yes.
Now, what else are we seeing as far as trends when it comes to command, like establishment of command, command being stationary versus mobile?
Still that stationary mobile stuff. Stationary mobile is still I think we're starting to see really good numbers on 360s. What we're still finding is if the first unit doesn't do the 360, probably it doesn't get done for at least 4 to 6 minutes. If that first unit doesn't do a 360, it probably ain't going to happen until the BC gets there. You need to be sitting in your vehicle on a 50-watt radio so that you don't miss the Mayday. We have our data now shows that a lot of these Maydays are being missed because people are being in a mobile position rather than in a fixed stationary position. So, we're our worst enemies to a certain extent. We've got to get in a vehicle, stay in a vehicle.
And it's just not the radios. I've watched videos of Maydays where the IC has the radio in his back pocket having conversation with people while the Mayday is being transmitted, and they never even realize it. They never hear it.
Yeah.
Because of all those distractions and not being in a good communication position. Well, do you have anything else that you have discovered recently or something you'd like people to know about that we didn't cover yet today?
I think what I said near the beginning is that we've got to do a better job of making sure that company officers can run a command level Mayday. And because, like I said, we're seeing a large 30+% of Maydays are being run by company officers because there's no battalion chief there yet. So we need to extend what we are teaching our battalion chiefs in this area, in Maydays in particular, or RIT operations. And it's awful hard if you have a crew inside that's having a Mayday and there's only 2 crews outside. It's going to be pretty tough to do a RIT operation correctly. But I think what we need to do is we need to extend some of that command training that we're giving our battalion chiefs to our company officers. I've been a fan a long time that if you got company officers who are senior in their position and are going to move up or ride up as battalion chiefs or whatever, they need to have the same training as the guy that was sitting in that seat you pay every day. We are doing a disservice to our people if we just pluck a captain out. Well, today you're the battalion chief, thinking that they know what they're supposed to do when probably they don't, especially in running a Mayday. So we need to extend some of that command level training that we do for the company officers in particular.
And the trend continues that Maydays are being resolved from the inside out.
From the inside out, yes.
That hasn't changed, right?
That number has actually grown.
Okay.
We're doing a much better job of self-rescue or the crew, initial crew making the rescue. Those numbers are up almost 7%, which may not seem like a lot, but it is when you look at 10,000 Maydays. That's a pretty significant number, and the written numbers are down a little bit. And part of the reason, I think, is probably 2 reasons. One is that RIT teams are not we don't utilize them the way we probably should. And the second is that we expect a crew of 4 going in to make the rescue. They're going to assist those crews that are inside getting that guy out. Those crews inside are already near out of air. They got to come out. So if you're sending 4 people in thinking you're doing an 8-person rescue team, it's actually a 4-person rescue team. And they got to do that, whatever it is. And I think the third thing, and actually it's the number 1 thing, I guess I should have started with it, is that when RIT teams go in most of the time, they don't take the right equipment because they don't know what the Mayday actually is. They're just told, hey, you got a Mayday, guys in the basement. Okay. They don't say that, he's got a broken leg or that he's trapped or whatever it might be. They're just going in with the RIT bag. Okay. You can only do so much with that RIT bag. Maybe you need a Stokes basket. Maybe you need a backboard. Maybe you need a saw or whatever. And all of a sudden they get in there and they got to call outside. That delays the rescue because command didn't ask the right questions initially. So it slows the rescue down. So it's again a sort of a command issue to a certain extent, but at the same time, it's us not utilizing RIT teams the way we should.
And good command training, because that when we simulate Maydays, that's exactly one of the things that we make sure that people know that Mayday can report will give you what you need to take with you in order to mitigate the Mayday. Well, Don, we appreciate all the work that you continue to do and the great information you feed to us. ProjectMayday.net is where you can find all of that. And yes. We look forward to getting more updates from you as we go along.
Okay.
Thanks, Don.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
And that wraps up this edition of Bee Shifter. I want to thank Don Abbott for being here. This is part one of a two-part discussion. I hope you join us next time as Josh Bloom and I will get together and discuss the data that Don is cranking out and how do we address that in the American Fire Service. Until next time, thanks for listening to Bee Shifter. Please be safe.